together to create this sacred space for our ancestors who journeyed before us, those that lost their life fighting for freedom, have left their legacy for their descendants who have taken up the battle and amplified it without limit. We are Yamala.
welcome to the commemorative annual UNESCO Day for remembering the Transatlantic Slave Trade and its abolition. Thank you to our ceremonial drummers, Yamala and Sister Winora, for the blessed opening libation for this very important event. My name is Yvonne Field, founder and CEO of the Ubele Initiative. Ubele is taken from Swahili to mean the future, and we're a community wealth building organisation for Black and minoritized communities, both in London and across the country, as well as internationally. We call ourselves a catalyst organisation as we hope to bring new ideas into being, as well as supporting communities to develop. Thank you for inviting me to host this highly significant event, to remember the millions who suffered and died from the transatlantic slave trade, to honour those who fought to abolish it, and to advance the recognition of the impact of the transatlantic slave trade by the British government. We remember people who made waves in the water. This is the fourth time, second time online, that City Hall, Greater London Authority, have held this important event to commemorate this day. This year's theme is Justice and Restoration, and the event is of major significance for African and Caribbean heritage Londoners, as well as for the rest of the world. This evening's hybrid event, I'm here live in City Hall, and also I'm here with Sister Winora and some others. So we're here in person, but also we've been joined online, live on Zoom, as well as with pre-recorded messages. And together we bring an outstanding group of international academics, policymakers, artists, performers, and young people who between them will offer us a deep and lasting sense of why we need to remember, acknowledge, and still take action to ensure that all those who were impacted by the transatlantic slave trade receive justice and restoration. This event is particularly poignant for me as I began to research my maternal side and looked at what happened to us during enslavement. I started this some 8-9 years ago by looking at the Legacy of Slavery's website that has been put together from research undertaken by University College London. I live in Haringey, although I was born and brought up in Lewisham, and I found there was a direct connection between my family and the person who actually built Haringey House and Edward Grey. My grandmother was Adelaide Grey, and I found that in the borough that I actually love living in, because I live in Tottenham in particular, has a direct connection to Edward Grey. He founded Haringey House. It had 14 rooms and 7 bathrooms. He had an impressive collection of masters' paintings and innovative hot houses that had tropical flowers. Although I love living in Haringey, it can sometimes be a deeply disturbing coexistence with this knowledge of my part of my history, that I live so close to the history of enslavement of my direct ancestors. My grandmother and parents were born and brought up in Jamaica. City Hall, Greater London Authority are recognising this event following the request from the Windrush Foundation in 2018 to host an annual event to mark the commemoration of the UNESCO International Day for Remembrance of the Transatlantic Slave Trade and its abolition. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank those who were involved in campaigning for this day to be recognised in London and in England after a 14-year campaign. I would just like to end my introduction by saying a few things. I want to say that for African and Caribbean heritage Londoners, as well as for Black people across the rest of the UK and globally, every day is Sankofa Day, a day of remembrance. And some of us will have attended the Sankofa Day event in London at the weekend, and we stand in solidarity with those who organised it. We call for the dismantling of institutional racism that is deeply embedded through and from the transatlantic slave trade. We fight for equality and justice for Black people in the UK, including all of those who have lost their lives to systemic racism to this very day. We're in solidarity with the renewed energy that we've seen in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement, and we push together across the world as Black people to demand justice. As the CEO of Abolition, I extend my condolences to the families who remain, including my own, and those all over the world, and want to say, and end this piece, by drawing on the words of the great late Maya Angelou, "And still I rise." I would like now to introduce you to the Assistant Director General for the Social and Human Sciences of UNESCO, Gabriela Ramos, for an opening speech. Gabriela oversees the contribution of the institution to build inclusive and peaceful societies. Her portfolio includes social inclusion and gender equality, anti-racism and anti-discrimination. Gabriela's appointment at UNESCO allows her to continue supporting an agenda of inclusive growth and the respect of human rights and human dignity. I would like now to invite Gabriela to speak.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, and it would be lovely to be in London today, but we are very proud that Londoners and the communities, Mr. Major, yourself, have really put this celebration, the UNESCO Day of Remembering the Transatlantic Slave Trade and Abolition, core to this day and to these events. Because every August 23rd, the international community commemorates the Haitian Revolution of 1791 and the first state that granted rights universally to all of its inhabitants, no matter their origin. And I would like to send some thoughts and our support to Haiti, which has really show us the way in that moment, but that are also showing the resilience and the fact that they're standing up at this very, very difficult moment in their life. And I would like to thank all of you that are associating your city and your cities and your communities with this day of commemoration. Let's just remember, forgetting offense and memory when shared abolishes the offense. This is what Edouard Glissant, the fantastic Martinican writer, taught us. And remembering that historical events and what you have referred to is crucial today for at least 3 reasons. First, because we have a duty to pay tribute to the enslaved women and men whose fight and passion for freedom are still a huge source of pride and inspiration. Second, slavery was abolished, but it did not end. There are more people in modern slavery today than what were transported across the Atlantic. And third, slavery legacy still poisons our existence today. The Black Lives Matter movement denounced the perpetual vulnerability engendered by the systemic racism and discrimination faced by hundreds of millions of people of the African diaspora. And we know the numbers, how much they were at higher risk of dying, a higher risk of losing their jobs, a higher risk of being discriminated. This vulnerability was exposed really further by the COVID-19 pandemic. And hence, we want to take this opportunity not only to remember or to the remembrance, but also to take it as a reference point to assessing how to advance a real agenda for freedom and dignity, how to use these legacies to move forward and to end up all these very difficult circumstances that these communities and our communities are facing. And faithful to this mandate and to this legacy, UNESCO is upscaling its work against racism with the global call against racism adopted by member states in December 2020 as the cornerstone of this effort. We are developing an anti-racism roadmap, pushing for what works, for those experiences that are positive and that we can advance, and to strengthen also the tools that we have, developing a toolkit for all those policymakers and decision makers that have something to do with these issues to take the right decisions. Central in this context is our program on the slave route, where we develop scientific research on the history of slavery to deepen our knowledge of the ideological foundations of racism. We are also launching an innovative healing project to address the psychological consequences of slavery on the descendants of both victims and perpetrators. But we do not only want to document the sad story of this, we also want to bring all the contributions that the African diaspora and that Africa has brought to the world. We are spearheading the effort of a general history of Africa. We developed a school curricula to promote a truer vision of African past, highlighting the contribution of African diaspora to modern societies. And we want to deconstruct prejudices, stereotypes, and preconceived ideas that fuel racism, discrimination, but also we want to celebrate the wonderful music we just heard, the wonderful contributions, and all those things that have come for us through Africa. And our International Coalition of Inclusive and Sustainable Cities, ICAR, in which London is a leading member, gathers cities willing to share good practices to combat racism and discriminations. So I want you all to invite you all not only for this day of remembrance, but of all this work that UNESCO is pushing forward to upscale the efforts and to really close these difficult chapters and to advance an agenda for change. Let's keep remembering, but let's also continue building a stronger agenda. Let's continue joining forces. We are proud to be part of this movement. We are proud to be at the core of this celebration and commemoration day, but we will be more proud if this contributes to redress the situation and to arrive to a justice and more fairer world. Thank you so much, and looking forward to the continuous events.
Poignant words, and for outlining and reinforcing UNESCO's commitment to the global call that it's developed to racism, and that they are actually developing a number of anti-racist initiatives over the forthcoming year and years. We look forward to hearing how they unfold and how the UK can make a major contribution to these. It is now my pleasure to welcome one of our musical guests to this ceremony. Voice of Love, led by Jason Porter, will sing their version of Black Butterfly and Glory. When I looked up Black Butterfly, I realized that it was actually sung by one of my soul heroes from the 1980s, Denise Williams, and actually I absolutely adore the rendition of Glory. So I look forward to hearing what I understand from one of my colleagues, the fusion, or as she said to me, a mashup of the two pieces of music for this particular ceremony. So over to Voice of Love and Jason Porter.
Glory, When the glory comes, it'll be ours, it'll be ours. And one day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Spread your wings and fly.
Beautiful rendition of Black Butterfly and Glory. And actually, you may not know, but Jason was a quarter-finalist in The Voice in 2018, and I remember seeing him perform live on that programme, and it was he just blew me away. So really pleased that we're able to have him and his choir sing for us this evening. Very special rendition. Okay, so my next guest is Deputy Mayor for Communities and Social Justice, Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernard. Since taking office, Dr. Debbie has made it a priority to promote social justice and equality for all communities, and has been a key player in driving London's social recovery from COVID. I met Debbie through the work that we've been doing in Abolition about 18 months ago, and I know she's been doing sterling work, and it's been a pleasure to work with her and her team over this period. So I'd like to invite Debbie to say a few words, to also introduce the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and to commemorate this very special occasion with us all. Over to you, Debbie.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this event to commemorate the UNESCO Day for remembering the transatlantic slave trade and its abolition. It is a great honour that for the first time this year, we've been given patronage support by UNESCO, and it's great that Assistant Director General for the Social and Human Sciences of UNESCO, Gabriela Ramos, was able to open our event. Before I continue, I'd also like to say a special thanks to our Community Advisory Group and to our GLA officers who've worked tirelessly to pull this event together. This is our second year delivering this event online, and we have expanded our guest speakers from as far afield as New York, to France, to Kingston, Jamaica, and back to the UK to put on a great programme for all of you. Our theme for this year is Justice and Restoration, and it is an honour to have Professor Sir Hilary Beckles as our keynote speaker. Professor Beckles' decades of academic work and advocacy make him the perfect speaker for this theme, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from him later on. I'm now going to pass over to the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, to deliver his address.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending this important event to remember and honour the millions of African men, women and children who suffered and died as a result of the slave trade. This was one of the most horrific chapters in human history. We simply must never forget the oppression faced by fellow human beings, the tyranny that was inflicted upon them, or their brave battle for freedom. In fact, it's incumbent on us to make sure that today's generation and our children know of this awful history, no matter how painful it is to recall. Not only so they can comprehend the gravity of the crimes that were perpetrated, not only so they can be on their guard against the sick and twisted ideology of racism, but so they can understand the origins of many of the injustices that continue to blight our societies today. While it's the case, of course, that slavery is now illegal, the truth is that too many black people in our city remain weighted down by poverty, deprivation, structural inequalities, and a lack of opportunities. It shouldn't have taken a global pandemic or the murder of George Floyd for many to see what we've known for too long. That systematic racism and racial injustice is still alive. That has a pernicious influence limiting the life chances of far too many in our black communities, and that there are people in our society who simply are not afforded the opportunities and even the basic human rights they need to prosper. In London, we've made it our mission to tackle these issues head on, from ensuring our public realm is more representative, to making City Hall a proactively anti-racist organisation, and from helping businesses diversify to skilling up young black Londoners so they can fulfil their potential. Clearly, we still have much work to do to fashion a city and a country where all are treated fairly and equally. But in times of struggle, history can also serve as a source of hope. It was Nelson Mandela who once said, "Poverty is not an accident. Like slavery and apartheid, it's man-made and can be removed by the actions of human beings." It's worth remembering we put an end to the horrors of the Middle Passage. We did that. We did put an end to the grotesque system that was apartheid. We did that. So if we continue in that noble tradition of struggle, if we continue to raise our voices rather than staying silent, if we continue to fight what is right, then through our collective endeavours and through collective action, we can bring about the transformative change that's needed, achieving a fairer, more equal, more just society and a brighter future for all of our children, regardless of the colour of their skin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sadiq. And as outlined by the Mayor, it's vitally important to remember and to honour the millions of people who suffered as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and the impact that this has had on generations of Black communities here in London and worldwide. So through this event, we aim to bring communities together to better understand their shared history and how the history of London connects to histories of enslavement. These are histories that cannot and must not be forgotten, histories that we must share amongst ourselves and also with our children, histories that remember that the wealth of this city has been built on the backs of our ancestors who fought and died for freedom. It's important for us as Londoners to come together every year on the 23rd of August for this commemoration event in partnership with the community to mark the International Day for the Remembrance of Transatlantic Slavery and its abolition. It's also important that we share in this moment to recognise those enslaved people who bravely fought for their freedom across the Atlantic world, from Haiti to Jamaica, from Brazil to the United States. This day is also a time for us to come together to take pride in the Londoners who campaigned tirelessly for abolition from right here in our city, including Olaudah Equiano and Ottobah Cugoano. To honour them, we will continue to work to ensure that London is a place of freedom, where no one is discriminated against because of the colour of their skin, the language that they speak, or the country of their birth. There is still so much work to be done, but together we can continue the legacy of the great men and women who have come before us, whose footsteps we walk in on London streets and beyond. I really hope that you enjoy the rest of tonight's event. I'm always incredibly grateful to those of you who join with us, who give us your time and share in this remembrance. This event is important because of you, and I thank you for being a part of it.
Thank you, Mayor of London Sadiq Khan and Deputy Mayor Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernard, on your encouraging and insightful words. I'm struck by the fact that the GLA have supported the efforts of many who campaigned to get this day recognised in the UK. And I look forward to working alongside you to ensure that the commitment to an anti-racist London is fulfilled. As you said during your presentations, the global pandemic and particularly the impact of Black and minoritized communities in London in relation to COVID and then the murder of George Floyd really brought so many things to the fore that we knew as Black communities still existed within our society. And as you said, Debbie, there's still so much work to be done. So I look forward to hearing your plans in future. I'd like to now introduce Nairobi Thomas, who's going to recite her poem entitled Slave Ship from Zoom. Thank you, Nairobi.
Thank you very much. This poem is from my unpublished collection entitled Unvarnished Truths. As previously stated, this particular piece is called Slave Ship. In the belly of the sea beast, head to head to toe, shackled and lying in urine, fecal matter, and menstrual flows. Death, disease, and utter despair are meats with rotting bread, rejected by the stomach, used to pounded yam, fresh fish cooked in fire spice, and fruit from the cradle of life. The violent rolling over motion of the ship in bowels of hell darkness keep male and female, young and old, battened down by multiple rows of Leviathan teeth in the dank cold and rancid air. Dehumanized kings and queens vomit the foul offerings made to them as unsuspecting saviors of transatlantic enterprise. The breath-stopping stench and offense to God. Warriors shackled to teachers, shackled to architects, shackled to sculptors, shackled to weavers, shackled to philosophers, shackled to singers, shackled to hunters, shackled to mathematicians, shackled to the lower decks without respect to their statuses, education, skills, or achievements. Kidnapped and never chained to someone of their own tribe, so that bonds cannot form, spirits cannot be lifted, hope cannot be born. The desperate need to flee cannot be organized, agitations quashed before they begin. Since no one speaks a common tongue, you cannot devise strategies on how to make a run. Jamba looked into Fulani eyes. Wolof cried on Mande's shoulders. Igbo tended to Bantu wounds, all searching for universal words that would facilitate a strategic escape. But the only language shared by all was abject fear and totally disorienting misery, floggings, and chains. After sea shanties and swabbing the decks, night finds the crew in contorted silhouettes, with disease-ridden cod pieces committing genital crimes, testing the merchandise, spoiling virgins, corrupting wives, with covetous eyes on little boys and little girls, telling them in unknown tongues their turn will come. Untreated wounds from being savaged become infected. Affected minds and dejected hearts make prayers directed to ancient gods to end the suffering. And when supplication is met with life traded for death, the cargo is thrown overboard. And the new owners gain financial award for their loss. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. I'm a long way from home. I'm a long ways from home. When Slaveport is reached, Bristol, Liverpool, Plymouth, Lancaster, Dublin, Belfast, Limerick, the beast spews out onto shore the many to more indignities, with promises of unending degradation, perpetual starvation, touching every generation, humiliation the staple diet, with reminders of being God-forsaken, the reason they were taken, hot iron branded into skin, a watchtower on every waking, that the only human here is the one with the whip. In London, Newcastle, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Birmingham, Bath, Manchester, the empty ship creaks and groans with annoying hunger to be filled again with Africa, her blood, her oil, her diamonds, her copper, her minerals, her cocoa beans, her gold, always hungry, never filled, always hungry for Africa. True believers, true believers, we're a long way from home. We're a long way from home.
Deeply moving, eloquent, and passionately read poem that reminded us of the horrors of the Middle Passage and also how the UK cities benefited and still continue to benefit today from the labours of our ancestors and from those who are here now. We will take time to reflect on what we've heard during this ceremony. However, we'll do that after we've actually heard from our keynote speaker. Fortunately, we've been able to reconnect with Professor Hilary Beckles, and he will provide the keynote speech from University of West Indies in Jamaica. Just as a reminder, Professor Beckles is the 8th Vice-Chancellor of UE, and he's a distinguished academic, international thought leader, United Nations Committee official, and global public activist in the field of social justice and minority empowerment. He's also served as an advisor on UNESCO's Cities for Peace global program. He has a number of notable publications, including White Servitude and Black Slavery, the First Black Slave Society, Britain's Barbados and Britain's Black Debt, Reparations for Slavery and Native Genocide in the Caribbean, to name but a few. And all of those publications, plus others, are relevant to today's learnings. As mentioned earlier, during Professor Beckles' keynote, you can submit your questions on the chat, and I can see questions are coming through already, so thank you. However, to allow us to actually concentrate on as many questions as possible, comments will not be published. If we don't actually get to ask your question to Professor Beckles, we will still be able to answer them after the event, so please keep them coming through. Remember to keep your questions short so we can fit in as many as possible. And if you like other people's questions that they've written, then please put a tick against them. For those that have the most likes, we'll try and actually answer them as a priority. So do send your questions through now and during the keynote. So again, with no further ado, please welcome Professor Sir Hilary Beckles from the University of West Indies. Good evening, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so very much. Allow me to recognize, of course, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and his deputy, Dr. Debbie Weeks Bernard, and to also recognize the chair of the London Assembly, Andrew Boff, and to say what a tremendous honor it was just to sit and listen to Nairobi Thompson speaking so eloquently on such a terrible subject, but so deeply philosophical and riveting. And thank you, Nairobi. Thank you. It is entirely appropriate, I would wish to begin by noting that for the City of London to participate in the remembering of the UNESCO Day in respect to slavery, the slave trade, and of course, abolition. It is appropriate because what we are gathered here to speak about this day is the greatest crime ever committed against humanity. And London was at the heart of it. It's a crime whose harm and suffering continues to haunt humanity in this 21st century. It's a crime that has anchored the evolving 21st century within a legacy of untold human suffering that, and there is no carpet in the world that's big enough to brush this under. For centuries, the City of London, as the financial heart of its nation, gave definition, shape, and form and sustainability to this crime. Indeed, London rose to become the world's financial institution, a reputation and status it sustained for over 200 years because of this crime, because of its capacity to structure, define, and sustain a slave trading and chain and chattel Africans for 300 years. And no other city in the world knew how best to do this than the City of London. And so easily it brushed aside Amsterdam, that competed for that status, and so easily it brushed aside Amsterdam to emerge without rival as the center of an imperial structure, a global imperial structure in which slave trading and slavery were the existential cause of that global imperial model. Without the capacity, the skills, and the commitment of the political leadership of the city and the corporate managers of the city, the slave complex would not have evolved as rapidly and spread as globally as it did. It's impossible to speak about slavery. It's impossible to speak about slave trading without understanding the City of London, the mother of that crime. I was born on the small island of Barbados. And Barbados was the first project and product of the City of London. The very first map that was ever drawn of Barbados was drawn in 1657, just 30 years after it was financed by the merchants of London, the enterprise that captured this island from the native people and made it a British enterprise property, was financed by the merchants of the City of London. And on that map, one third of the island is described as the property of the merchants of London. This is the very first map ever drawn of Barbados, 1657. And a third of the island, in fact, one would say the best third, because of the agricultural land, because this was the place that the City of London had deemed to begin sugar plantation slavery in the Americas. This was the project of the City of London, to establish plantations, to bring 6,000 West Africans, mostly Ghanaians at the time, across the Atlantic into Barbados to begin this project of slavery. City of London then produced all of the relevant institutions, the financial institutions, the political institutions, the leadership, and the social institutions that enabled this enterprise to flourish into the greatest economic system of the world, slave plantation, chattel slavery. There was no enterprise in the world, there was no institution in the world that was larger, greater than the slave complex, the slave trading, the slave manufacturing, production, and the City of London was at the heart of this enterprise. It is important to hear the voice of the Mayor of London to reflect upon this history, because the mayors of London, they were the ones who hosted the slave owners. They were the ones who legitimized the slave owners. They were in themselves some of the primary slave owners in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. It were the mayors of London who not only managed the money generated by slavery, they managed the message that erupted about white supremacy, about the fact that African people were not human beings, that they were property, they were chattel, they were real estate, they were non-human. It was the messaging that enabled this enterprise to go on for centuries, that emerged out of the institutions of the City of London. Returning once again to Barbados. In 1816, the African people rose up on this island and fought a battle for 7 days against the enslavers. After 7 days of warfare on this small, beautiful island of Barbados, they were defeated. Thousands of them were massacred as a result of having the audacity to believe that they could overthrow slavery and declare themselves, like Haiti, an independent nation. The hero of that suppression was an English military man, Colonel Codd, and the mayor of the City of London hosted him in one of the finest banquets ever held in the City of London. All of the elite society of London were invited to come and raise a glass of toast to Colonel Codd for defeating the African army in Barbados and the Caribbean. And that was funded, that banquet was funded not only by the city, but with a major endowment from the Earl of Harewood, who was the largest slave owner in the Caribbean at the time, owning over 7 plantations in Barbados, Jamaica, and Tobago. The Drax family also made a substantial donation to that banquet. And it's ironic how, indeed, today, we are still talking about the Drax family, because Richard Drax, who is the richest man in the House of Commons, the family that had made its greatest fortune out of slavery in the Caribbean, he sits on that fortune. He sits in the House of Commons, but he was also the result of a family that insisted that there was nothing wrong with enslaving Africans. There was nothing criminal about that, simply because the Africans were not human, and you cannot commit a crime against non-humans. It was the City of London that was able to put together the £20 million to compensate the slave owners within the context of the emancipation legislation. The British government invited the City of London to raise the 20 million to pay reparations to the slave owners as compensation for the state appropriation of their property value in 800,000 enslaved Africans. The City of London, through the Rothschilds Merchant Bank, was able to put together that 20 million to pay the slave owners. No compensation for the enslaved. No compensation for 200 years of free labor from 20 million people. Yes, that's what the British was able to achieve. 200 years of free labor from 20 million Africans who were then set free, penniless and without liberty. These are the crimes that continue to haunt the City of London. The mayors of London established their monuments in every square, on every significant street corner, and every public space. The mayors of the City of London established monuments to these criminals who were able to get away with it because it was said that slavery was in the national interest of Britain. Remember King George saying to Wilberforce, this conversation about emancipation, be very careful. Slavery is in Britain's national interest, so be very careful with the speeches you give in the Parliament. All of this is modern history. This is not ancient history. This is the history of today. When citizens demand that the monuments of these criminals be removed from public spaces in a triumphant civilization of white supremacy, they know what they're speaking about. The mayors of London were the ones who did this. They were the ones who signed the documents to landscape the city, to have it populated with criminals all around us. The mayors have a duty to undo that which they had done. They're the ones who have an ethical responsibility. I note that the University of London is now involved in an effort to research this matter. But this University of London grew upon the profits of slave owners. Slave owners and slave traders made this significant endowments to the University of London to say, we need a university to deal with the education of the children of the middle class, the children of the commercial classes, the children of the industrial classes. We need a university in London to reflect the commercial and financial history of the city, and to do so by sustaining slavery, slave trading, and the colonial enterprise. Which is good that London University is now researching this history. However, the evidence is very clear. Yes, they researched this history. Yes, they present some of the findings of their excellent research, but at the same time, they run away from the consequences of their research. And so we now have a political circumstance called research and run. Research and run has become the standard in British universities, where they look to see the extent to which they drank from the well of slavery, but haven't done the research, haven't collected the evidentiary basis of their own crimes and the way in which the universities participated in these global crimes. their main impulse is to run away from the consequences of their research. And so research and run has now become the standard within British universities. Reparatory justice is not a part of their agenda. Research and run, not research and repair, not research and restitute, not research and restore. Research and run is the standard refrain and reflects. And so there's a tremendous amount of work to be done, because no university can be excellent if it is also not ethical. There is no university that can claim the value of being excellent if it is marred in behavior that is unethical. And this is our claim. Research and run is not ethical. Neither can it be the basis of an excellent university. Just a week ago, we at the University of the West Indies received the communication from a distinguished British philanthropist by the name of Bridget Freeman. And Bridget wrote to us and said she's been following the narrative on slavery reparations. She's been listening very carefully to the programs. And for the first time in her life as an elderly white British woman, she felt shame and guilt about the legacy of her country in the Caribbean, Africa. And she reached out to us. And she did say she felt ashamed that she was never exposed to this history while she was in school. She was never exposed to this by her public media, and now she's ashamed. She was able then to say, well, I hope this will help, a token gesture. And she made a massive reparations contributions to the student fund, the needy student fund of the University of the West Indies. I wish to thank Bridget Freeman for making that substantial contribution to needy students who are struggling to sustain their connection to university through no fault of their own, simply poverty, the legacy of slavery. And while the British government might continue to claim that they have no responsibility for the consequences of slavery, while they might wish to maintain the view that slavery was a long time ago, while they might wish to maintain the view that they can distance themselves from this crime, it is wonderful to see that civil society, not only the mayor of the City of London and all of the institutions and those who are making an effort to repair this history, it's wonderful to see that they stand apart from the official position of their national government. We have seen history like this before, where citizens are given no choice but to rise up and stand up and to do the right thing, especially as they know that doing the right thing stand in opposition to the views of their own government. So colleagues, I'm honored to be a part of this reflection upon the UNESCO Day, Remembrance of Slavery and Slave Trade, in this global crime that continues to wreak havoc and harm upon people in this 21st century. This century will be the century of reparations. There is no doubt that reparations is going to be the greatest political movement of this 21st century. There's no doubt about it. The whole world, the whole colonized world, the enslaved world, the brutalized world, the racially oppressed world will put together this movement for justice, and it will be a global movement, and all over the globe, there's going to be demand for reparations. This century, we insist, must be the century of humanity. And if it took us all of the 19th century to eradicate chattel slavery from the world, from Haiti in 1804 to Brazil in 1888, all of the 19th century, and if it took us all of the 20th century to convert emancipation into civil rights and human rights, and if in the process we have lost thousands of our best people in the civil rights movement, the human rights movement, we reflect upon the lives of all of the great heroes of Toussaint L'Ouverture of Haiti. We think of Marcus Garvey, we think of the the murder and the assassination of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. We think of the incarceration of Nelson Mandela and all of those others. All of that price that we paid in the 20th century for our human rights and our civil rights. This 21st century is going to be the century of the reparations movement. And we're going to fight to the very end. And if it takes us all of this 21st century, as it took us all of the 20th century, we are going to persist and we are going to triumph. And we know that the City of London, that was at the center of all of this, will rise up and will play its part, will play its role, because we have some very fine people in the City of London who are living their lives and who are committed to justice and freedom. So I thank you all for the generosity of your attention. Thank you very much.
Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, thank you so much for such a clear, unequivocal, insightful, reflective, historical, challenging presentation. Not only did I learn many things that I didn't know before, but also it made me think about, particularly towards the end, the role of the universities. I've just finished working at one of the universities of London that sits on top of that endowment that you've mentioned. And I think their approach is to research and run, and I will be challenging them about their approach. We have a number of questions that have come through. The live chat is buzzing. I've got a few on my tablets here that I'll take first of all, and hopefully we can get through a few of them within the next 10 minutes or so. However, I think we've made a commitment to answer questions, even if we can't do them this evening, that we would actually answer in writing to those people who have submitted that didn't get a chance for their questions to be heard. I was also struck by the role of mayors of London and the challenge now to Sadiq Khan to actually be involved in this campaign to ensure that all Londoners are repaired and receive reparation for the enslavement of their ancestors and the continuing impact of this on our lives. So I just start with the first question that had 14 likes. I'm trying to look at those that had a lot of likes in the first instance. So the question is, should there be a renewed global effort for reparations to countries that suffered the worst of the slave trade? Should reparatory be served to all the descendants of enslaved African people? So there are two questions there from the one person.
Tremendous campaign is being planned at the moment, not only in the Caribbean, but also in the institutions of the United Nations, to establish a global summit on reparations and carry on and many of the facilitating organizations in the UN system, the civil rights and human rights institutions, as well as the Slave Roots Project. We're all hoping that sometime in this year that we will have that summit in Africa in collaboration with the African Union that would bring the global reparations movement together to speak about this matter. I think the argument has been won that reparatory justice is inevitable. The issue is how best to achieve it, who should have the authority to structure and to design and conceptualize what it should look like, and how to ensure that while it has a reparatory function, it is also at the same time creating a greater sense of justice and humanity in the world. And we believe that the reparatory justice movement is a healing movement. We believe it's the way to turn the world in the right direction. So those of us who persist in it are not doing so for limited means. We, of course, have objectives, but we also have the grander philosophical objective of restoring the common humanity of the species. And this is important because as Africans, we have always seen ourselves in that way. Humanity originated in Africa, And whether we like it or not, Africa is the mother of all humanity. And therefore, we will always assign that special role and function to Africa as a symbol of that common humanity. Yes, so there are different methodologies that have been put in place. These are for conversations. In the United States, for example, where people have been plundered in recent years, publicly murdered in recent years, when you link this loss of property and life in the current time against the background, they're demanding an approach that is different from the approach in the Caribbean, which is focused more around development support, development partnership, support for public health, for public education, infrastructural development, so that the poverty that was left in the Caribbean, the poverty left by Britain, the massive colonial mess left in the Caribbean by Britain, that Britain must come back and participate in cleaning up the mess that they have created. All of these problems in the Caribbean, the vast majority of them are legacies of British colonialism. Britain has a duty to come back to the scene of the crime and help to clean up the mess they have left behind. So yes, there are some broad issues and broad approaches, but like all great political and philosophical movements, there is diversity of thought. And that diversity of thought is not a weakness, it's a strength.
Okay, thank you. And just to come back to a point that you made earlier, questions, at least one question's come in about it. I'm sure there are others. And the question is, should descendants of the British trade who were paid taxes in the UK, which were used to repay the 20 million, now receive a refund of all the taxes that have been paid that went towards repaying the debt? As you mentioned earlier, the commission that raised the 20 million to pay those who enslaved us is being paid back by ourselves until very recently. So the question is, should we receive a refund of all the taxes that we've paid, which have gone towards paying the debt?
There's no doubt that this is an immoral act. There's no doubt about it. Within the finest traditions of parliamentary politics and the finest traditions of democratic administration, the fact that my parents, who were a part of the Windrush and who worked in British industry for 50 years, and that their taxes had to pay to allow that bond to create the interest for those who held the bond over the decades since emancipation. This is an immoral act. I mean, this is the depth to which an empowered class of politicians can sink in their indifference to public sentiment. It is an immorality, and no doubt, the people of the Caribbean, the people of Africa should, their income, their taxes, their fiscal participation should in no way be associated, indeed, with the fact that the British government was still honoring down to 2015 its obligation to that slave bond. And to have a slave bond, our time, our taxes, it's a gross immorality by any standard, especially when you consider that the enslaved themselves in 1833 were calling for compensation. They were saying they had their lobbyists. As that act was working its way through the parliament, the enslaved people were making representations. How about us? We are the ones whose labor was stolen. We're the ones who were criminally brutalized and had our humanity taken from us. This is why we say that the Emancipation Act is the greatest racist act ever passed in the British Parliament. Because the only way the British Parliament could have passed that Emancipation Act was, first of all, to agree in the Parliament that black people were not humans, that they were property. And the Emancipation Act proceeded on the declaration that we were paying property compensation. We were not paying to free people. We were paying property compensation to those who owned the 800,000 enslaved Africans. So the act itself proceeded on the basis that black people were property, were not human, and then proceeded to pay property compensation to those who owned legitimately that property. And such an act, again, is a criminal act, that Emancipation Act. It's criminal because it denied human beings their right to their humanity. And then to the double indemnity of paying the reparations to the property owners and not to the enslaved people themselves. And for the British government to continue to persist with the argument that it did nothing wrong, that slavery was not criminal, slavery was not illegal, we did nothing wrong and we will never apologize. This is the depth of immorality and criminality that has been associated with slavery and compensation to this day. And given the fact that the City of London, its political leadership, its institutions, its financial leadership are all responsible for this, they have a tremendous responsibility to turn this narrative around, to turn it around, and to find itself in the vanguard of democracy and justice.
Thank you, Professor Beckles. And just one final question that I'd like to ask you from our audience. As I mentioned earlier, we will collect all of the questions and hopefully you'll be able to respond to them over the next few weeks. But actually, why do you think that Britain refuses to actually formally acknowledge its part, and not only its part, its leadership role in the perpetuation of the slave trade? What is it that you think that they're scared of? What is it that they're running away from? What is it that they're failing to actually acknowledge, and why? And what do you think we can do in order to push our government to actually acknowledge what they've done, and that they should actually be seriously discussing repair and reparation as part of the conversation?
Well, there are two ways to look at this. One is having created and lived within a civilization that insists that Africans were not human and treated them as such. Having lived upon a culture that has maintained that value system, it is so very difficult for English people to rise above that standard. So very difficult for the British Parliament to rise above a standard it had sustained for 300 years and to create a different epistemic view which says, not only are these African people human, in fact, these African people are superhuman. They're superhuman because they survived this. They maintain their humanity despite of it. They have gone through what no other group of people on planet Earth have gone through, and they have survived and they have maintained their culture, their value system. We are insisting that we have gone through a process of self-repair, and we have done all that we can along the journey to repair the harm done to us. Excuse me. And so we are calling upon them to recognize this. And the best way to recognize this is for them to admit that we implemented the most brutal economic and social system the world has ever known upon these African people, and yet they are here with us, alive and thriving. And therefore, the best way to celebrate this is to come on board, admit to the crimes that they have committed, remove all the doubt that exists in their own political history. And I can tell you, when in Durban in 2001 at the UN Conference on Race and Reparations, I led the Caribbean delegation on this matter. Baroness Amos represented the British government on this matter. And you can very well imagine how we in the Caribbean how the African delegates felt, how Black people from North America, Latin America, how we all felt when Baroness Amos, beautiful, beautiful, Black, smart, intelligent woman, could look at us, Black people from all over the world, and said, Britain has done nothing wrong and will not apologize. You can imagine how we felt when she was placed in that position. So we're speaking about divide and rule. This is how they have always divided us. This is how they set us apart. This is how they imagine that the young people today will walk away from this conversation. Because their argument is, if we can stay around long enough, the younger generations of Black kids, this history will slip away from them. They will remove themselves from commitment to the conversation. And then, with the matter filtering through the Black community and filtering out of the Black community, this will all be put to rest. But when we hear poets like Nairobi Thompson, and we hear the young people, and we hear the younger people listening, we come to realize that strategy is not going to work. The young people are not going to walk away. They're not going to be de-educated. They're not going to be desensitized. On the contrary, their consciousness is rising and emerging. So that strategy will fail. So basically what we're saying is, this is the time to come to the table to talk about all of this. It can make an enormous difference to the world because it is only a matter of time. It's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when. So let's begin in earnest the diplomatic conversation. The CARICOM countries have invited the British government to have a summit to discuss this matter. The British government continues to speak about aid. We will give you aid, but we don't think that reparatory justice is the right approach. But they should not be telling us that reparatory justice is not the right approach. They should not be saying to us, we will give you more aid. But where did the aid come from in the first place? The aid is like you break into my house and you rob me, and you loot and plunder my riches and my resources. And then I say to you, I want it back. And you say, well, you can't have it back, but I will give you a little part of it by way of aid. I mean, that is the metaphor. We will give you a little part of it back in the form of aid and let the conversation end there. So a 21st century Black consciousness is deeply, deeply offended by the notion that the call for partnership and repair and mutual development and mutual respect concludes in a conversation about aid. It is extremely disrespectful. It is something that Black consciousness in the 21st century will always reject. So it's a non-starter. So let us begin a conversation about development, about mutual respect, about history, about the future. It can be done. We have some fine diplomats in the world who can negotiate this. Britain can only be a better nation. It will only be a better nation when it owns up to its historical circumstances. So long as it remains detached from this history, Britain will be shrinking into a small island nation state in the world. It will not carry that status in the world that it desires until it does the right thing.
Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, I'm not sure how to follow any of what you've just said. You've thrown down the gauntlet to the UK government, to the world, and I know from Black Londoners and Black people around the world and our allies that we will be following your leadership. You've talked about the young people, and I was thinking about them before you mentioned that actually young people have a fire in their bellies these days, which actually is not going to dissipate. It's getting stronger and stronger. So I'm sure that they also will be following you, your colleagues, and their younger leaders to ensure that we actually receive justice and restoration. So thank you so much for your presentation and your comments and thoughts and insights. I feel deeply moved by what I've heard this evening. but also I feel even more empowered to move forward and to support those in the world who are actually leading our case for reparations. I'd like to thank everybody who submitted questions. As I said, they will be answered in due course. We are running slightly late because obviously we had a technical hitch. And because what's just been shared with us is so deeply moving, absolutely poignant. I mean, my heart and soul have been deeply touched this evening. I'd like us just to spend a moment, a minute, just reflecting on what we've heard. And also what we've heard from other presenters today for this particular very special program. So maybe we can just take some breaths to process some of our feelings and just have a short moment of reflection before we move on towards the final parts of our program this evening. I'd now like to invite Andrew Boff, Chair of the London Assembly, to say a few words to mark the occasion of this important day.
UNESCO has described today as an opportunity for collective consideration of the historic causes, the methods, and the consequences of this tragedy. And this is what we're here to do today. We honour and celebrate the men and women who campaigned for abolition and who fought for their freedom. We think of those from Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where on this day in 1791, we saw the beginning of an uprising that will play a crucial role in the abolition of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Those who laid down their lives to ensure that Africans were no longer enslaved on the island need to be remembered. And today the world is a better place because of their contributions and sacrifice. We need to learn lessons from the past, and that is why the Assembly supports this event and works with communities to ensure that the significance of this day is recognised. And it's important that we are all here today to continue to make London a city that unites people and celebrates diversity and champions equality. The London Assembly and the Mayor will continue to support the hosting of UNESCO's international commemoration of August the 23rd. We pledge to work together untiringly for the elimination of racism in all its forms. Finally, I'd like to pay tribute to everyone involved in today's event, to the organisers, the staff, and the excellent speakers at today's event. Thank you for your efforts and work in making today such a success.
Thank you, Andrew, for your comments and support. At the beginning of this programme, I mentioned the involvement of young people in this event. And I'd like now to call on young people, young Londoners, and young people from the London Youth Assembly who are representatives from different youth forums across London that create positive change for young people. I'd like to call on them to make a number of affirmations. As participants in this event, we'd like you to join us in saying Ashe at the end of each affirmation, which is a word from or term from the Yoruba people in Nigeria, which means conceiving the power to make things happen and to produce change, or so let it be. Ashe also refers to the spiritual life force that flows through things. We will now hear 8 affirmations from our young people.
We affirm that this annual remembrance of slavery, its abolition, and the revolutionary resistance in Haiti on the 23rd of August continues the cultural tradition of Sankofa, looking back so that we can learn how to create a better future for us all. Ashe.
We affirm that the women and men who fought for freedom on 22nd of August 1791 not only secured liberty and independence for themselves and Haiti in 1804, but also laid the foundation for the establishment of universal human rights, for which we are all indebted. Ashe.
We affirm that the names and deeds of these courageous freedom fighters from across the Caribbean, Africa, and East Diaspora deserve tribute with education and research, teaching their story and their revolutionary values against exploitation and oppression. Ashe.
We affirm that in 2011, UNESCO recognized and forced the enslavement of African people, the Marfa, not as a trade, but as a crime against humanity, an act for which no legitimate reparation has been made. Ashe.
We affirm that the Marfa and the Magazimi is not merely a subject of the past, it is history that has shaped the face of the world, creating binding ties between people and continuing and irreversibly transforming the destiny, economy, and the cultures of nations. Ashe.
We affirm that the legacy of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism remains an unsolved wound requiring justice and healing if we are to stop the spread of political, economic, and spiritual trauma across generations. Ashe.
We affirm that in March 2019, the European Parliament recognised Afrophobia as a growing concern and voted for its member states to act against the inequality and discrimination faced by the estimated 50 million people of African heritage living in Europe. Ashe.
We affirm that the study of this history is equal to paying tribute to those Africans who fought for their freedom and to their unique contributions to the affirmation of universal human rights. Those freedom fighters have set an example for us to continue fight against racism, inequality, and inequity that endure to this day. Therefore, we join UNESCO to annually remember the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved peoples and its abolition. Ashe.
Thank you to Cheneke Orchestra UK and Europe's first ever black and ethnically diverse orchestra for championing change and celebrating diversity in classical music. And thank you for the beautiful rendition of Beethoven's Symphony No. 5, known as a Symphony of Fate, which presents triumph over adversity. As we draw the evening to a close, I am really moved and deeply touched by the programme that we have engaged in this evening. We called on our ancestors to support us this evening. We shared their story of enslavement and liberation, and we know that there is much more to be done as we go forward through our generations. However, it's clear that we have international support for us as Londoners so that we can actually achieve justice and restoration in the coming months and years ahead. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Mayor of London and his team for working with local communities to support and host this event. I would like to thank the support that I've received as the host for this event from specific members of the team. I'd also like to thank all those who participated and contributed to the event, the academics, and particularly Professor Sir Hilary Beckles. I know that we'll be in touch in the future. We have common ancestry from what you were saying this evening. I'd like to also thank the representative from UNESCO, the artists and performers who helped us tell our story to such a wide audience in such a deep and meaningful and creative way. And I'd like to thank the young people who actually affirmed for us this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to call this event to a closure, and I'd like to actually call on Yamala, our women drummers that we saw at the beginning, to officially close this evening's commemorative event. Thank you.
Corruption and hatred for who we are as a people.
civilization made an immense contribution to the world and is still a marvel as today. Freedom, Africa! Africa, freedom! And so the journey continues. We are the messengers for our